morning and welcome. We're starting a few minutes late, but that is keeping in Simon's tradition of always being late. I'm Richard Page, for those of you who haven't met me. I had the privilege of being Simon's friend, colleague, collaborator. We supervised PhD students together. For about 10 seconds, I was Simon's line manager until we sized each other up and think that wouldn't work, so we just stopped that. I was asked to compare this event today, and one of the reasons I agreed beyond loving Simon deeply was somebody said to me, I think it might have been Rob, that I had some gravitas, and I can just hear Simon laughing at that statement. So we're here to celebrate Simon's life and share stories, and I think it's really a measure of who we are as human, as how many stories are shared, how much impact we've had on other people, and we'll hear many fascinating, sad, and funny stories over the next hour or so. So I'm not going to say any more except to hand over to Rob Alexander, who will give the obituary. Rob.
So in February 2009, Simon became a lecturer at York. Now, faculty positions, permanent faculty positions, are hard to get. And he was very pleased. I remember him saying to me that it validated his decision to come back to school. It validated his decision to take a contract research post, which is always a little precarious, and not to stay in industry, which is obviously something he knew so well at that point. And as an academic, he did some great research work. He used the platform and the flexibility that a permanent academic post provided to choose what he worked on and who he worked with. As part of his job, he taught many formal courses and made an impression on many students. And he helped many peers and graduate students, particularly with statistics, often with software engineering. And as part of that, and also because of his keen wit and infectious laugh, he made many friends. Now, most academics, once they become one, get a permanent post, they tend to stay there for their whole career, and more than a few at the same institution for a very long time. After about 2 years, Simon was frustrated with the bureaucracy of the academic life, particularly when he would lean over in faculty meetings and say things like, "Why are we even discussing this?" So he quit, with an intention to do something completely different and possibly, as he eventually did, to move countries again. But he still kept in touch with friends from York, and that is why this event is happening here today. And I think this shows Simon in three capacities. He was a remarkable scientist and engineer, he was a great teacher and mentor, and he was mercurial in employment, but a good and loyal friend. As a scientist-engineer, Simon was perhaps the best fusion of these two I've ever met. He was known throughout the academic world for his promotion of scientific rigour, for insisting that computer scientists use the right kinds of statistics, that they know what they are doing in terms of statistics and epistemology, although he would never use a pretentious word like epistemology. And insisting that people be adequately sceptical rather than just chasing, "It works!" and the academic status that comes with it. But many academics who were taking that kind of role, and he's had his kind of zeal and expertise, would have used it for high and mighty judgment, to build their status, to strike an arrogant pose. But Simon did not. He was always gently persuasive. He was aspirational. He would offer standards not as something that you must meet or be a terrible person, but as something you could aspire to, that you might rightly seek. And that endeared him to people and probably made his message much more effective. Before coming to academia, Simon spent many years as a software engineer at a variety of companies, starting with Logica Finance in the UK, straight out of university, circa 1990, and later several companies in the US. The one he spoke most fondly of was 170 Systems in Boston. Colleagues from his time in industry tell, again, of his trademark brilliance, fused with an easygoing humility. For him, no question was too stupid, especially if you were junior to him. He would rather teach you than hoard knowledge. And at York, the resulting technical expertise born of long effort often enabled the ideas of others. More than once, it enabled that, combined with his mathematical skills, enabled colleagues to finally do that analysis they'd been trying to work out how to do for years. And the reason perhaps why Simon was so good was he was a lifelong learner. At Bristol Grammar School, in the early 80s, I'm told he got straight A's for every subject in every school report. He came to University of York in 1986 to study mathematics and graduated in 1989 with a first-class degree, in the process managing to spend a year as the Student Union Welfare Officer. But that's a pretty good qualification, especially when paired with his industrial experience that he built up. But Simon was worried because he had heard you couldn't learn advanced mathematics after 40. So in 2005, at the age of 38, he returned to York to do an MSc in mathematics. He did reasonably well there as well. According to the maths department, we checked, he never received a module mark below 91%. And his final project mark, which he never told anyone about this without coaxing, was 100%. I have a little insider knowledge here, though. The second marker, the supervisor wanted to give 100%, but the second marker only wanted to give 98. But his sole argument, the reason it was 98, neither 98 nor 99 was awarded, was because the second marker, the only reason they could come up with for not giving it 100% was that no one ever gets 100%. And I might add that project report turned fairly soon into a paper in a major chemistry journal. He'd been working with a couple of chemists, and something that his supervisor said, yes, I corrected a few typos. Other than that, Simon did it. He continued his academic performance into his PhD. His PhD thesis, was a runner-up for the 2014 British Computer Society Distinguished Thesis Award. What a high honour. But I think more important than that is its status in York computer science now. It is routinely pointed to as an example of what a good thesis looks like, and given as a model for graduate students to follow. I use it in this way, but I caveat it. When I give it out to them, I say, the structure of this is good, and the way it's written is very good indeed. But don't think that you have to do this well. The bar is a lot lower than that. From my own observation, there was often, I think, an effortless quality to his work. While many of us in our hard research and programming roles, we frown, we tense our muscles, there was always a grace about Simon, to the sense that he almost seemed to type elegantly. Beyond his engineering and scientific brilliance, Simon was a great teacher and mentor. He made dull subjects interesting, in part through his warmth and humour and humanity, and part by really relating them to the real world. Simon taught, in part, statistics for engineering, which could have been an extremely dull subject, but he brought fun to it. And I think this is perhaps best illustrated by what is known as the cake talk. He wanted to illustrate a common academic failing, to wit, an academic has been working for months or years on making a new computer system, a program, an algorithm, and they want to demonstrate that it is amazing, empirically, through science. How do you do that? Well, you measure its performance and compare it to a rival. Now, this thing, their system, is their implementation they have, the program they are running, is the product of months and years of hard work by them and their highly specialised postdocs. But you also need an implementation of the rival system, which is often something, might well be something that one of their graduate students knocked up in an afternoon. And many academics, they just often didn't think about this, and I think many more junior students would blunder into doing that, not realising that this disparity of quality was a problem. And Simon wanted to make an impression on that, so that at the very least people would remember that this was an issue. So we procured 2 cakes. One of them was an exquisite Black Forest gatto, made by a local cake shop at no trivial expense, and one of them was, I would believe, from Tesco's. And it wasn't the value chocolate cake, it was the one up from that. And he put up those two to illustrate the point. And quite likely, a lot of the details he would later say in that same talk about what makes a good comparison, what attributes you should make sure your comparison system had to be fair. But you might forget those, but you would probably remember the cakes. And remembering the cakes might spark guilt. And the guilt might spark you to go back and check, perhaps his notes or perhaps somewhere else, what you should do to do that comparison well. Simon also taught the wider process of software engineering management, which could have been painfully dull. Part of his solution was to put students into group work, formally and informally, where they had to deal in a role-played situation with customers, the customer, or with senior management, notorious bogey person figures who you would often meet in the real world. But he was smart enough to aware that there were two problems with this. One of them is that, one of them was perhaps not a problem for Simon, but for many people, especially academics, it would have been an opportunity to act superior, to show how much more you knew than the students, to show, particularly in his case, with his experience, he knew how the real world worked and what senior management and the customer would not put up with. And that might have been a lesson, but that could have damaged the relationship with the students. And he also knew that could happen accidentally, even with the best will in the world, because it's hard to separate an act from a person. So he procured a prop. He had this top hat. And what he would do was that when he was about to become the senior manager or become the customer, he would put on the hat. And then the game was on. And then when he removed the hat, he was Simon again. He was your friend, he was your coach, he was your mentor. And this, I think, is a brilliant illustration of the understanding that he brought to the teaching situation, not just the content, but understanding the human dynamics, and thereby being a much better teacher for it. With his talents, Simon could have been arrogant, distant, and reveled in his superiority. But many students and former colleagues will attest that he loved the aha moment when a student finally got it, even though it meant that the gap between them had narrowed and that he was now less superior than he was before. Now, I said about Simon in employment and in friendship. Simon had many friends from different places and eras. In Bristol, when he was born in October 1967. In London, where he worked for a time in his younger days. In Boston, in York, and in Karlskrona. He'd had more than a few troubles of his own in his life, and he used that to empathise, and he was a good listener with it. Now, as an employer, you couldn't hold on to Simon. He had sharp judgment. He had no patience for bullshit, for pretense, or for attempts to push him around, because he knew he could do great things wherever he was. To hear him speak, here's a version of it, he walked out of more jobs than most of us will ever have. Sometimes they coaxed him back, sometimes, but often he moved on, sometimes radically. Simon could fall out with people too. And sometimes it was that the people had kind of earned it. Some of you, particularly from York a few years ago, may remember the falling out he had with the Residents' Association in the flats where he lived. And this culminated in the mystery of the disappearing car. For those of you who have not heard the story, I will not attempt to recount it now, partly because there isn't time, and partly because Simon told it so well. It was a shaggy dog story he could make last half an hour, interspersed with giggling. And sometimes, when someone fell out, it was him being a grumpy bastard. One time I heard of, the strawberries brought as a peace offering had to be left outside his office door because he wouldn't open it. And I would mention this is an office door in the Ron Cook hub, and every office door in that hub has a vertical window in it, and he could be seen inside, pointedly ignoring the bringer of gifts. But though Simon would fall out with friends, he generally came back. And when he left and moved on, as he did, he tended to stay in contact at a distance. He loved to Skype back to friends in York or to arrange holidays with friends from here. Indeed, he'd had a trip planned for New York in December to celebrate his 50th birthday. Now, perhaps few people got to be as close as they could like because he moved around quite a bit. But that meant that many more people were able, in some capacity, to be his friend. Simon's death is tragic, in part because he was so loved. But also because, in all the time I knew him, he so obviously seemed to learn and grow. I mean, many people seem to set their ideas in stone about 35 and to let their knowledge and skills start to ossify a little, especially in the academic world, which can be quite slow time. But Simon didn't. And there was little sign at 49 that he was slowing down. Thank you.
I'd like to invite the choir and David to come up to lead us in some music. Thank you so much. We're now going to have some tributes, some stories, anecdotes. You might get a little blue from some friends and family. And we're going to start with Bronya.
Right. Hello. Good morning. I came up yesterday on drove up from the south, and on the radio there was someone speaking. They were talking about funerals and singing, actually, importance of live music and sharing some music like this, really bringing people together. I just sense that this room is full of lovely people. I sense it. Someone said that on the radio yesterday, and I thought, well, I wonder if that will be the case, and it is. I can sense it. And you must be, because Simon was in your life, and Simon is in our lives. So I am Jo, Simon's mum, is my older sister, so I am Simon's auntie, Bronya, and Jo and Ray. Jo can't be here today. She would love to be here, and I just want to say from her, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Richard, for your fantastic opening, and I've learnt so much already. I'm looking forward to the blue stuff that's coming, and because he was full of fun, and I know all sorts of things went on that Jo and I can only guess at, but I will be telling her. And Jo can't be here because sadly Ray, Dr. Ray Paulding, now is nearly 90 and has extreme dementia. And Jo just felt it wasn't a good idea to leave him. So when I said I was coming, she felt okay about that. So please understand that. She's here in spirit. Okay, so I don't know whether you knew this, but Simon's maternal grandmother was from Yorkshire. And she was my mother, Barbara, Simon's grandma in Plymouth, was very key in all the cousins at that time. So I have a son who and a daughter about the same age as Simon, and Simon's brother Danny. So the four of them, the joy of going to Grandma's house for Christmas and holidays, you could just see it in their faces, and she adored it. She'd been a widow for quite a long time, my mother, and having us back in was all she cared about, and that was the same with her and all her 5 older sisters, the Hay girls, who all were brought up in Halifax. Yeah. So, which were all names I knew, you know, and as I came through and I thought, oh, Halifax, yes, Sheffield, Rotherham, you know, and these are all names I knew, but I was born down in Devon, so forget that. So my mother was deeply rewarded by the fact that when Simon did start school, the reports would come home, and Richard's mentioned them, and I know Dominic, my son, used to go, I suppose we're going to have to see one of Simon's reports. And the idea, when he was only 7 or 8 or 9, you know, because they'd come in and my mother would say, look at this. And, you know, they were astounding. Simon, of course, was even then this modest, somewhat embarrassed, you know, boy, and you know, I guess he didn't know what the fuss was about. He really didn't know what the fuss was about. Anyway, moving on. So he was always modest and shy, but the thing about Simon, when he was a tiny baby, absolutely white blonde hair, shining blue eyes, he was breathless with enthusiasm about anything, and he was into construction toys and puzzles and complicated card games and all that sort of thing, which Joe, totally, his mother, nurtured with him in a very quiet, you know, they'd be sitting there like that, and Danny and Dominic and my daughter Rachel would be, you know, doing all this stuff all round and tearing open Christmas paper, and Simon would be, oh yes, you know, very intense. But he had a huge curiosity, and in fact Joe used to worry because he didn't really begin to talk until he was about 4. And the real reason was because his brain was going so quickly and the ideas was coming so quickly, I feel. I mean, Joe was about to take him to a therapist, a speech therapist, and then it all came out. And he just took off from there, and he was just full of fun. Now, you'll see some photographs outside. I'm winding up now because I think I'm going on too much. I was a teacher, I'm sorry, but it's not good. And there are some photographs of those Christmases, and you'll see Simon overjoyed, loving oranges and lemons and all that sort of thing, and playing. And there is a very funny row of them. We made them dress up. Because we like to kind of humiliate children in the Hay family, I think. And Simon, you will notice, is the Christmas parcel. And you can read it in his face like, oh no. And the penguin next door is Danny, his brother. Luckily his face isn't showing, and then the rest of them, and my daughter Rachel is the very angry looking dumpling of a nurse standing there looking at all of 2 years old and kind of thinking, what are we doing? Anyway, they loved those parties, and my mother loved it. Finishing now, but Joe said to me when the news came through that dreadful Monday morning not very long ago, one thing you should do, Bronya, because I was saying, you know, I just remember him being this breathless, enthusiastic boy, and I just got that memory. And she said, well, you know, and he didn't speak, did he? And she said, have you watched those YouTube lectures that he's given from, I think it's Sweden, in the university? So, you know, I got my iPad and I was looking, and there he was, and that was quite sobering. And then I tried to follow it. 10 seconds. And then I just thought, and then I was completely won over by his gentle genius, his modesty, his warmth, his almost sort of laid back presentation of what the hell he was talking about. I have no idea. Something to do with statistics. Anyway, and that's how I remember him. He wore his genius really lightly. He was modest. You've mentioned lots of things that I can think of about him, but I didn't see him so much. But Kerry is going to talk about teenage years. Thank you.
I think I'll just stay here, that's all right. Another teacher, I'm afraid. It seems to be, I've just worked out 50% of us that are here today are teachers. So there must be something genetic about it. But just to put me in perspective, I'm a couple of years older, and so I would have been on the family holidays with Simon, Danny and Dominic and Rachel. But I come from the northern branch of the family, so I didn't see them on the regular basis. So I wanted to just talk about the times that we spent together, and I think you'll start to see that we all have lots of memories in common of certain qualities of his. So when I looked online at everything that Simon had been involved in, I was just incredibly struck by the sheer quantity of papers and research that he did, and how much he was involved with. And I was really struck by how much he worked in teams with other people. And, you know, my experience of academics is generally they don't play well together, but he seems to have played really well with lots of people. And I could just tell, and standing here today, you know, you can tell just how much he valued him and his contributions and his lively character. And I want to remember Simon as part of a team, mainly contributing to a lot of family fun and shenanigans. of which he was perhaps more the master of than you might have realised. So it is really ironic that Simon was involved in new technology and at the cutting edge of everything when we had this really kind of pre-electronic, very sort of Enid Blyton summer holiday experience. And, you know, we had a lot of fun without any of the new technology. And I think what I remember looking back to those family holidays is that he had a really devilish sense of fun and was really enthusiastic, super, super intelligent. And I too suffered the inevitable report comparison. I cursed him for that again and again. You know, you just hoped your school report came out before his. You got some glory before that. Anyway, we would meet up in the summer holidays, and that we have a hugely extended family. There were an awful lot of us. Not unusual to have 30 or 40 people together at my grandmother's farm in Devon, where it has to be said the adults were careless and we were left to run feral. And I love seeing this picture as I came in because my grandmother had a massive pond, there were many canoes. We spent a lot of time falling out of them, falling in them, capsizing them, and so that is something that really chimes with my memories of us. As we forced him into the dressing up box, which he never enjoyed, but for some reason we were always dressed up in some sort of outfit, running around. And one of the things I do remember is that our parents let us drink woodpecker, unsupervised woodpecker cider. And Simon and Danny could produce this innocent look that would allow them to go and fetch another bottle. And so I think, unknown to you parents, quite a lot of the time we were not entirely sober. Perhaps not a good thing, it's 11, I don't know. So this developed, I think possibly as everybody got a bit more money, it developed into mass trips to Butlins. You know, it's quite a big deal to take 30 people to Butlins. We would be lined up in the morning, given cash, have a key tied round our necks, and be pushed out the door and not allowed to return till tea time. Parents could only be found playing bingo and drinking gin. And I remember Ray, very competitive family, we didn't want to take part in the competitions, they made us. But I am Butlins Minehead Picture of Health winner. So, and for fancy dress, Ray took us down to the lake at Butlins, and the result was that all of us fell in the lake. Dominic, Rachel, Simon, Danny and me and Ray all fell in, and I can't remember how that happened. Mystery. But as we got older and more money must have come about, we ended up in these big holiday homes in Cornwall. And this is where Simon and Danny revealed their strategic planning skills, which I'm guessing you are already aware of. And my dad would take us on a traditional trip to the local joke shop. And we didn't buy randomly, we bought with a plan. We bought with a list, and then we would go home and establish a period of quiet to lull the adults into a false sense of security. But meantime, Simon and Danny would have this astutely planned, coordinated and merciless wave of attacks. And Simon was particularly good at playing the innocent, so it was he that distributed the sweets that turned all the great aunt's dentures bright blue for the entire holiday. Nothing got it off. And then we would continue to torment with snappy gum, rubber insects, sugar cubes made out of salt, itching powder, some well-paced whoopee cushions, and some hot dog poo, which he enjoyed immensely. He really did. But although my memories are of sort of very Enid Blyton activities, there was a memory that popped into my head, and I remembered going down to visit Simon and his family in their home in Bristol. And we were greeted at the door by his mum Jo and his brother Danny. No sign of Ray, no sign of Simon. And we eventually had to go upstairs. And I remember Simon sat at a desk, Ray standing behind him. And he'd got the first Sinclair ZX81. So I'm guessing, was that 78? 78, 79? And you couldn't get anything out of them. They was just like zoned out. We're looking at something that's like a cross between a stylophone and a portable tape recorder, thinking, what's this? And I don't think they even managed to say hello to us. So clearly he had an amazing skill. He could see into the future and see all these possibilities that were going to come along where we were just completely blind. So my personal memory, being that couple of important years older, is that he was just not a typical teenage boy. He wasn't surly and quiet. He could be quiet and reflective. But what I remember about him, particularly when I was at university, was that he was great company one-to-one, and he really did want to get into having any kind of discussion with you, to share his knowledge, to find out what you knew. And, you know, once he'd got a good idea or a strong opinion, there was just no stopping him. Absolutely no stopping him. And I remember him just being full of enthusiasm, full of excitement, somebody who was endlessly curious, wanted to know how things worked, and was really interested in what you knew to see if it was different from what he knew. And that he loved sharing the knowledge that he had. And he did love a heated debate, there's no doubt about it. But I think I will always kind of remember this bit of chaotically in and out of boats, running around, dressing up, nicking woodpecker, and looking aghast at the adults and what they wanted us to do. So I think it's just lovely to be here and share what clearly we're all seeing very similar traits in Simon.
I want to start by thanking Sam and Anna for getting in touch with me. I'm not quite sure how my name came up, because I suspect none of you know me at all. I don't know any of you. I haven't seen Simon since he was 25. My Simon is forever 25, and I recognise my Simon in a lot of what I've just heard. I'm really going to look forward to hearing your stories about who Simon became. Despite the fact that I haven't seen Simon since he was 25, we have actually stayed in touch for, I was counting, 30 years. We met 31 years ago. And some of that came from him. We were lucky. We both have ridiculously distinctive names. We're very easy to find. Thank you, parents, for really odd names, okay? In the Google age, it's wonderful. I want to not exactly correct something, because I think I've got this right, but nobody else has mentioned it. But I want to give you an idea of just how smart Simon was, because I don't think I'm wrong. Simon didn't do maths. Simon started with maths, and then he got bored and switched to physics, and then he got bored again and switched to maths again, without any gaps between any of them, and got a first in every exam. Okay? That's how smart Simon was. Now, I don't want to talk about me, but you need to understand, in my line of business, I hang out with really smart people. I know the Vatican astronomer, okay? I know people who worked on things like the Hubble telescope, on Dolly the sheep. And Simon is still one of the smartest people I ever met, okay? And I'm not that smart. I'm smart enough, but you know, Simon was one of the people I would point to and say, second class is just cool. Seriously, second class is just fine, thank you very much. Simon and I met the second week of university. We met because we went to the Lesbian and Gay Society. It's 1986. There were only 5 first years who joined that year. 3 men, 2 women, my friend Kiz, who's also no longer with us, sadly. And I wasn't sure how much to talk about this, but I'm looking across the room and I'm seeing quite a lot of young people. And I know from my own students that most younger people don't actually realise how difficult it was to be out in 1986. Okay, it was legal for women, but only sort of. Coming out had consequences. But for a gay man in 1986 at university, you were illegal. You were under the age of consent. The simple act of stating you were gay, of walking through that door, was incredibly brave, okay? And I know I don't look it now. I suspect Simon didn't look it. But we were both unbelievably shy at 18. one of the issues we both faced, neither of us had realised that something like 80% of York students took a year out before they went. Simon and I at 18 were between a year and 2 years younger than everybody around us, and we were in the Lesbian and Gay Society. It was actually really scary. In a way, it's hard to imagine now. My students, I cannot remember the last time one of my students came out at university. They know from the age of 12, they're cool. They look at you and go, why should we be worried? It was scary. We're the youngest, we're out. We had almost nothing in common. If we had a thing in common, and people have talked about this, it was our passion for our subjects, which, you tend to forget. Even in 1986, when only 10% of kids went to university, most of them didn't actually care about the subject. I mean, they liked it, but that absolute, we love what we're doing, not so common. And Simon and I were very drawn to each other because we loved our subject. And also, I'm a historian, but I've always been on the science side. My friends have always been disproportionately scientists, as you may have just picked up. So we had that thing in common, that we could have conversations with each other that we were embarrassed to have with other people, and they weren't the ones about sex, okay? But we could also have the conversations about romance because we trusted each other. And I noticed you talked about the one-to-one, and I will come back to that in a minute. So most of my memories of Simon, when I tried to pluck memories, I couldn't. They aren't like that. They're diffuse. They're about that contact and that sense of this terribly passionate, terribly shy, to the point of blushing. He had the prettiest blush. And absolutely clear, not necessarily on what he wanted to do in the future, because I don't think either of us cared about that. We cared about our subjects in the moment. But that sense we knew we were going to stick with our subject. And I realised also, as Kerry was talking about his interest in the future, that was the other thing we must have had in common. Because what I write about is science fiction. And we spent a lot of time talking about all the possibilities of computing, all the possibilities of physics, of things that were changing around us. And one of the things I do remember is never once being patronised by Simon, never once being treated as not a scientist. Okay, and by the way, I got a U in my physics GCSE. Loving science doesn't make you any good at it. And Simon could explain things to people in a way that made them make sense with clarity. You all know that, but you're talking about undergraduates. I'm talking about somebody whose interest is very much at the popular end. So there's that kind of intimacy. And then there's the fun stuff. Now, back to being gay in 1986, York. Okay, so if you go through the gate, you will find the York Arms. That was the mixed gay pub. It was horrible. I don't know what it's like now, but it was disgusting. It was the back room. It was dirty. I mean, truthfully, most pubs were back then. You didn't want to hang out. And then just around the corner was the White Horse, which is where the lesbians hung out, which I didn't know at the time I became a barmaid there. That was just lucky. I ended up working 3 years there, and Simon used to swing by and pick me up at the end and walk me back sometimes, because it's quite a long way back to Heslington. And I can't remember the name of the nightclub on Micklegate that had a Thursday night. And that was even nastier. I'm sorry, but you didn't want to know what was on the floors. You just didn't. The lights going up. No, don't look. But I was delighted when I saw the music today, because we're playing ABBA. And one of my clearest group memories of Simon is us all traipsing off on a Thursday night and dancing at the club, which always closed with an ABBA melody. And that's where I acquired my secret love of ABBA. I now have the complete discs in the car, so you don't have to be secret anymore. You had to be closeted as an ABBA fan in those days. It was almost worse than being gay. And then the other thing I remember is when Clause 28 started coming along, which would have been our second year. And that was the point, because I came from a very political family, but I don't think Simon necessarily did. But that was the point at which Simon, like a lot of people, I think, started realising that the politics was here, was now, and I think the slogan at the time was out of the clubs and into the streets. And we both became energised, and that's how we ended up campaigning for the role of lesbian and gay officer, which we held jointly. I think it's got a longer title now, which is quite right. And I don't know how much change we made, except it was 1986 and we were out. And in 1986, that was a political statement. And this terribly shy man who was willing to get up and say, I'm gay and I will be publicly gay for you. And that's a level of generosity that it can be hard to understand, I think. So I'm going to end there, but with just to say one more thing. We talked about the one-to-one. So when I tried to come up with my memory of Simon, the only strong single memory I have, but it's clearly a composite memory, it's clearly overlaid over and over again, is sitting on the steps at Vanbrugh, and I'm not even sure if they're still there, yes? Looking out over the lake and just talking for hours in the sunshine on a day like today, sharing whatever was on our mind at the time, because we were just people who really liked each other. And that's what I have to say. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your stories. Thank you.
Jez?
Okay, my abiding memory of Simon was I met Simon on a May afternoon in 1988, and it was a bit of an encounter in that he very nearly knocked me over as he hurtled at great speed on his bike down the lane that connected campus with the retreat. So having almost ended up in a hedge, and there was a few choice words exchanged, and then about 20 minutes later we met again a bit further on down the road, in that he had stopped to talk to a mutual friend. I stopped as well, and we had a conversation, and then we made this sort of impromptu decision to go out and have some food. And that set in train, really, a series of events and circumstances that meant that I suppose I'm here now talking about my friendship with Simon as a student. So we shared a house together. There was myself, Simon and Jackie, and we shared a house just off the Haxby Road. It's a little place called Eldon Terrace. And what happened initially was that Simon was already sharing a house with some other friends, and up in Badger Hill. Now, Simon then developed an allergy to the horsehair mattress that was on his bed at the time. So his rhinitis went into overdrive, and he asked Jackie and I, could he come and live with us instead? So he did. Jackie and I moved into the house in the summer, 88. And we've talked often over the years about this being our home. And it was our home because, for various reasons, the three of us lived in York, and we were students here, but we didn't just live in our accommodation during the term time and then disappear somewhere else. York was our home. And lots of other friends would come and stay and visit, and they would say, this isn't like a student house. We have toilet paper. And the washing up was done. And we had just about every conceivable kitchen utensil that you could ever want, as well as the ones that you didn't want. And it was our sort of domestic refuge, really, away from a lot of the stuff that went on campus and the things that Farah's talked about, the things that we were either involved in individually or collectively. And we had this little house in Eldon Terrace. Now, Simon's contribution to collective living was inventive, if nothing else. We had acquired a TV. Now, it was described as a portable TV, but it's fair to say that in 1988, it was about as portable as the Hadron Collider. And it had no remote control. So a bespoke remote control was fashioned out of liberating one of my sweet pea canes from the garden, cutting it down to about 1 metre, and putting some tin foil on the end. And it meant that we were excused from having to get out of the chair in order to change the channel, because we could just lean forward and make contact with the TV with our piece of bamboo cane. Simon had a habit of collecting coffee cups. And by collecting, I don't mean as a hobby, I just meant hoarding. And that periodically Jackie and I would go on reconnaissance around the house and find the coffee cups and so on. And I think there was one day where we probably got to about double figures and we collected all these coffee cups. And as a non-mathematician, I'm convinced this wasn't just laziness on Simon's part. He had explained to me very convincingly that you could turn that in the principles of topology, coffee cups could be turned into donuts. And so on the days and the weekends when he stayed in bed for a period of time, I was convinced that he then had a constant food source. He was never going to go hungry. He could draw upon coffee cups being turned into donuts. And on the occasion when we visited him in Boston, and we were driving through someplace, and of course this legend of Simon being able to turn coffee cups into donuts, we went past a place that sold donuts and Dunkin' Donuts, and of course that just sealed it in our mind that actually Simon and coffee cups and donuts were just inseparable. Lots of funny things in our house. As I say, people would come to stay and they would be there for days and nights because they didn't want to go back to wherever else they were living, because actually we just had a nice home, really. We had no heating apart from a gas fire in the living room, and the living room was on a slight slope going down gravitating towards the gas fire, and we would watch Ski Sunday on a Sunday. And none of us had ever been skiing, but we would practice our slalom skiing facing the gas fire as though we were going in and out of the cones. But I think the funniest thing was the day when the legs of Simon's bed with Simon in it came crashing through the floorboards. And this was really nothing to do with the coffee cups. It was nothing to do with anything that Simon had done. It was just simply we lived in a house that was rotten, and the floorboards and the joists gave way. Simon's bed came through the floor, and we then had to explain to the landlord exactly why the floor then needed to be replaced. And there's much more that I could talk about, but clearly there's not the time or the opportunity. But my abiding memory of Simon is coffee cups and donuts, slaloming to Ski Sunday, and the day he wrecked the house. Thank you.
Nina.
I am not a teacher, so I'm not as eloquent speaking, but thank you. I'm going to read off my script if you don't mind. So as Rob mentioned, Simon spent several years in the 90s and in the early 2000s living in the States and working in the software industry. I met Simon, a good part of that time was at a company called 170 Systems, which was based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And I met Simon when I started at 170. The company was really small. I think there was less than 35 employees when I started, and even less than 30 when Simon started. We were all 20-somethings, enjoying living in the city. We were working at a really cool young tech company. It was sort of the days when we had a full beer fridge in the conference room, and they would bring in a massage therapist every week, which was quite nice. 170 was filled with really incredibly bright and fun people, but even amongst this crowd, Simon stood out. When news of Simon's passing reached us in the US, he brought all of us together again. And as one former colleague noted, it's a testament to Simon that we're all here after nearly 20 years reconnecting with each other. Everyone felt truly blessed to have worked alongside him, to have learned from him, and most memorably, to have laughed with him. As we've been hearing this morning, Simon was brilliant technically. Plus, he had an amazing ability to see the business side of things. And we had a running joke that I was functional, not technical, even though I've had my entire career in the software industry. Simon was definitely both. He was also a master texter, so he would always comment that he had chubby thumbs. But yet, he still won the BlackBerry face-off, so we were still using BlackBerries back then. So every office competition we had, Simon was the master. His warmth made it really easy, as we've been hearing today, for people to connect with him. He was known by his colleagues and his customers for his honesty, his integrity, his intelligence, and of course his wit. Our former CEO said that once a customer had an opportunity to work with Simon, they would never want to let him go. They too fell in love with him. I have to go to the next page. So one of these customers went to extraordinary lengths to have Simon work on their project. So Sandia is a US national laboratory that deals with nuclear weapons and defense. So having a non-US citizen on site, not to mention giving them access to computer systems and developing software, required lots of extra approvals and special procedures. But once Sandia met Simon, they pushed to get him approved. But the best part of the story is that following protocol, they furnished Simon with a large sign that read "Alien." And he had to actually post it above his workstation, as well as carry it with him at all times. So in true Simon fashion, he carried that sign with pride, and it led to many funny stories and laughs with all of us. On a more personal note, Simon and I became fast friends within minutes of meeting each other, as I'm sure he connected with all of you as well. We bonded over our love of the WB, which is a television station, or used to be a television station in the US that aired programs targeting teenagers, which clearly we both related to. It was the station that launched Gilmore Girls, which was one of our favorites, and it's something that we even talked about just recently when he came back over. We also shared a love of English comfort foods, especially hobnobs and good tea, although he insisted that I replace my PG tips with Taylor's of Harrogate, Yorkshire tea. He was also a regular on my early dates with my now husband, Dan, who also worked at 170. Again, it was a very small company. And when Dan and I decided to get married, Simon was the first and only person that we told. With less than a week's notice, he flew from York to California, to be our witness. As well as my maid of honor. He took me shopping for my wedding outfit. I'm a terrible crier as well, an ugly crier. Simon wasn't just a friend, he was my best friend. When he visited us in California a few months ago while he was attending the Julia conference, he shared stories of living in Sweden and of his recent travels with Sam. At one point in the conversation, he referenced Sam as his best friend, and I must have given him a look. because from then on, Simon referred to Sam as his close personal acquaintance. Of course, this was delivered with a sly smile. But that was what was amazing about Simon. I think he made all of us feel important and special and cared for. He was generous with his love and his time. I'd like to close by sharing some comments from a few of his friends in the US who I know wanted to be here today. Obviously, it's a big trip. It's hard for them to get here. We were lucky to have known him. He was a mentor, a teacher through and through, generous with praise, sparing with criticism, a loyal friend and an all-around good person, a gentle man. He enriched all of our lives with his presence, and the world is a dark place without him. It is true that everyone will leave this world one day, but it's the impact that you have on fellow human beings that will be remembered. Simon meant a lot to me, to all of us. We love you, Simon, and miss you dearly.
Jen.
Hello. I knew Simon during our PhD days, so this would be in between 2008 and 2011. We were both PhD students at the same time, and I can speak for myself and definitely others that we were very fortunate to have him around whilst we were enjoying that phase in our careers. He came from industry with this incredible experience, but was also going through the same process that we were, the fear, loathing, and self-doubt that often goes through. It's better than that, honest. But he was, his door was always open, and he was infinitely patient and generous with his time. and yeah, just a fount of knowledge. And I had the privilege of working with him on a paper, and just learning a huge amount in that process, and being overawed by his incredible intellect and his his incredible work ethic as well. He was unstoppable. It was really something. I was thinking about a single memory that I could share, I guess. And I have so many wonderful memories of growing silly mustaches with him, and just all those experiences that I've heard of so far are just chime exactly with just him being open and warm and having wonderful conversations with him late into the night. But if you were to play a word association game with me and Simon, like if you said Simon Paulding, I wouldn't say his incredible wit and charm, even though all of those are massively applicable. I'd immediately say French onion soup, because I'll tell you why. And it goes both ways. Like if I hear French onion soup, I think Simon Paulding. And this, so we travelled a lot on our conferences together. So we went, all over the world really, like to Montreal. But one time in Paris, I'm sure many great stories start with that. But we had time to socialise in between the conference events. And after one particularly heavy night of socialising, we were nursing a particularly raging hangover the next morning. And we were just both in a terrible state, like barely speaking, which is something you wouldn't associate with Simon. But we walked around on a sunny morning in Paris, trying to find a cafe or something that will alleviate our suffering. And we sat down and we looked at the menu and thought, right, French onion soup for both of us. This will be fine. And we seriously had a deeply religious experience with that French onion soup. I just remember sipping it up and looking at him, and getting that. My brain has just cemented that memory, and that's all I think about. I can't. After all the time I spent with him, that's what I think about. It's crazy. But yes, after that he was back to his normal chatty self. Telling me his opinion on the French men, which, he said he rated them pretty highly. I said, they're very pretty. And him gently mocking my French as well. My attempts to negotiate ibuprofen from the pharmacist did not go well. Mal tête is not enough to get ibuprofen, apparently. So the last time I saw Simon was too long ago, certainly, and but he came back from a Devon trip and stayed with us in Woking, and we hit it off as you'd expect straight away. Drank into the small hours and reminisced, and spoke about what we look forward to in the future. And he was always the optimist. We were talking about about the AI revolution that was coming. This was a few years ago, and I was saying, it's going to steal all our milk. It's going to be terrible. And he was, always on the bright side and the possibilities and updating us in research. But yeah, he was just simply put the nicest man, and we'll miss him.
Jimmy.
Polled, verb. Ambitransitive, to make clear through the use of statistical analysis. Usages. I polled my dataset hard to reveal new insights into multi-threaded testing. I won the Best Paper Award by delicately polling my results until they sang. I was confused by my data, causing me to polled. Jan and I wrote that on Simon's office window back when Simon was a lecturer in the Department of Computer Science at York, and we were still wet behind the ear PhD students. I initially met him when he taught me undergraduate level, but I got to know him much more personally during my PhD. And one of the first questions I ever asked him was, what does the verb to poll mean? And he didn't know, so we thought it was only right that he deserved a definition for his nice name. And although silly, we think the definition does suit his name. As people have already said, Simon was terrifyingly intelligent and insightful, and he had this contagious enthusiasm for his work. It was Simon who got me interested in search-based software engineering. He and I and a few other people in this room wrote a paper together on evolving the AI for characters in a video game called Super Awesome Fighter. Those of you who are familiar with evolutionary computation will know that evolution likes to exploit whatever it can to survive, to score a high fitness. And Super Awesome Fighter was no exception. And as Simon polled our results, we learnt a life lesson from it. We learnt the best way to win any fight. So if you do ever find yourself in trouble, just crouch down on the floor and punch them in the kneecap, and you're guaranteed to win. I've not tested that, thankfully. But, as we've already determined, Simon was a very talented academic, and his results can always be trusted. Academic prowess aside, he was just a lovely man. When I think of him, I always imagine a smiling face, sometimes giggling, covering his mouth, and going red after making a crude or clever joke. Crude but clever joke, sorry. I will always cherish memories of him in his top hat, hosting the CS Christmas quiz, the infamous roundabout night, which a few of us also shared. Before he left York, he sold me his bike, so I actually think of him nearly every time I ride to work, which isn't that often anymore, but I would think I might ride it more regularly now. I'll miss Simon a lot. I would get very excited whenever he visited York. It was always a great opportunity for great fun and good, witty, interesting conversation, and obviously a trip to Wagamama's. And I regret never visiting him in Sweden. I think if roles were reversed, I think he would have definitely come to visit me because he was just the best of people. Simon was awesome, Simon was super awesome, and I will miss him dearly.
Should never fold things, just leave it stay there. So, in common with many of the people in this room, Simon and I share a passion for technology and gadgetry. Simon was a little more dedicated than me. The moment an update becomes available, he immediately downloads it, installs it, and then spends the rest of the afternoon complaining that it's not working the same, or something's not right. And I told him, hold off. In chess, only the pawns go first. He says, but that's how the best of us become queens. Yeah. I'll admit, Sam asked me to talk about our mutual love for Eurovision, but actually that wasn't our joint passion, that was him and my lovely wife, Emma. I think they only sat through it together once, but even so, every year on Twitter, throughout the semi-finals and finals, you'll know it's a full week of work. They were evaluating, comparing the relative merits, I guess, of all the contestants, and it's lovely to see it, and I'm sure we'll both miss that very much this year. This year he actually managed to perk my interest when he tried to use machine learning to predict who the winners of each round were going to be, and I would use the techniques he taught me to carefully evaluate how rubbish his algorithm was after each round. But I suppose he finally did lead me to Eurovision. As Farah mentioned, he led the way on so many sort of political and social issues back in the 80s. 86 was the year I was born, but the sorts of victories you guys won, the things that impacted a lot of the people in the room. You mentioned Section 28. I don't know if everybody knows that. That was the regulation that prevented teachers from being able to say that a homosexual family relationship was even acceptable. You just weren't allowed to. Didn't go away till the 90s. I don't think. He raised awareness of HIV and AIDS. He helped young women in York get over to Leeds when doctors in York refused to treat them. All areas where he was clearly on the right side of history. So, to so many of us, Simon was a teacher, a colleague and a friend. I think we should be inspired by him to be inspirations ourselves. Stand up for what we believe, convince people that we're right, forge a path, lead the way for everybody else. Become queens.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to talk about travelling with Simon and going on holiday with Simon. But before I do that, I've actually got a little addition to what Nina said. So on one of our last Skype talks, Simon referred to his best friend Nina. So I gave him a look. And he hastily amended that to one of my close friends, Nina. But what I think comes from this is that we were both so lucky to call Simon our best friend and him to call us our best friends. So Simon and I shared some amazing holidays from Berlin and Stockholm on city breaks to seeing the northern lights in remote Iceland and drinking gin in the midnight sun in the Arctic Circle. We had some amazing trips. And Simon was generally easy to travel with once you mastered the basics. You just needed to know two things. Firstly, Simon needed some alone time each day. Secondly, as soon as you landed, you took him to a supermarket and bought a thermos flask so he'd always got a cup of tea nearby when we were driving. After that, he was fine. So many of you probably don't know that on one of our trips, Simon accidentally became an Icelandic film star. We're driving in the remote Snaefell Peninsula, and we stopped to get some petrol in a little tiny petrol station miles from anywhere. After filling up, we went inside, and Simon walked up to the counter to pay and said, "Can I have a coffee, please?" The machine on the counter there. The guy behind the counter looked at him, quite disgruntled, and he said, "It's not a real coffee machine, and this isn't a real till. You're in a film." "I'm an actor." So Simon just gave him that look where he was sort of ironically, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Well, I hope you've got my good side." So I'd also like to share the story of this day when we were out in the bay here. And we were staying in Trondheim in Norway in this amazing flat which overlooked this bay. And with the flat came a beach cabin and a boat. So always a little bit risk averse. Simon wasn't that keen on taking this boat out, but after about a day's nagging, he agreed. But what he didn't want to do was go and get petrol to put in the outboard motor. So he said, "It's all right, I'll row out into the bay and I'll row back." So after hefting this boat down this stony beach, rowed out into the bay. And at this point, he's sweating a little bit, and he said to me, "It's quite hard work, this rowing, isn't it?" We could try and start the outboard motor. So we did. We started the outboard and we tootled around the bay. And it was a beautiful day. Just fantastic views and everything. All of a sudden, Simon said, "Oh, I think we better head back now because, we didn't get any petrol and I'm really quite scared it's going to run out." So we headed back and pulled the boat back up the beach and then settled down on the deck of this lovely cabin to this well-earned beer. So we were on our second beer when 3 people arrived, middle-aged couple and an older lady. The man gave us a sheepish grin and we sort of raised our bottles to him. And he went and fiddled with a boat further along the shore. 2 women sort of stood by him, sort of giving us black looks. And we thought, "Oh, gosh, Norwegians, perhaps they don't like people drinking in public." Anyway, we carried on drinking and giggling about boys we fancied and whatever. Until this bloke came up onto the cabin, went up to the front door and opened it. It was at this point that Simon and I, horrified, looked at each other and realised we were on the wrong cabin. The 2 women started coming towards us and they did not look happy. But Simon heroically saved the day by speaking to this chap in Swedish, which is understandable by most Norwegians. He explained that he lived in Sweden and a little bit about what he did. And the guy was really impressed. And then switching to English, we had quite a nice chat with him. What he didn't do, though, was after a glance at his wife, he didn't take the beer that Simon offered him. So anyway, ruffled feathers smooth, Simon and I went down the beach, we made a fire, we roasted marshmallows and we finished the rest of the beer. That was a fantastic day. And one really quick memory. So Simon and I used to go to these quite remote places and we'd use the sat-nav, and our nickname for the sat-nav was Doris. Doris took us to some interesting places. Looking for our Airbnb in Sweden, she led us into a forest along a narrow track, which suddenly ran out with nowhere to turn around. In Iceland, she suggested we might like to drive up a snow-covered glacier. And then one memorable time in the middle of Norway, she suggested that we turn left onto some railway tracks. It was after this incident that Simon became convinced that Doris was more than a synthesised voice. She was actually a real woman, laughing with her mates in a centre in Doncaster. And he did a brilliant impression of her. You'll never guess where I've sent mine. So I'm so sad that Simon and I never got to go on the 50th birthday trip that we'd planned to New York. But I'm really happy to have all the memories that I do, all the photographs, and all the many, many thermos flasks.
My first acquaintance with Simon was actually an application form for the lead RA post on the Seabase project. He had great experience in industry, working as a software engineer, including working, as it happens, for Logica, which was where Susan Stepney and I had worked before coming to York. He'd recently furthered his education by completing an MSc in data analytics and was considering an academic career. His interview was simply stunning. I remember it very, very well. He was calm, confident, articulate, and he knew what real software engineering was about. He was engaging and exhibited a genuine clarity of thought. What we saw was simply what we were going to get, which was a somewhat unusual experience for an interview. By the time the Seabase project had finished, Simon had established an international reputation in search-based software engineering and in search-based software testing in particular, a position he would further develop over the next 6 years, based in York and then in Sweden, working with Robert Felt in particular, to become one of the most important players in the field. More recently, he'd moved into embedded systems, XML testing, and research impact evaluation, amongst other things, and his colleagues at BTH in Sweden clearly enjoying and appreciating his collaboration. At his memorial service in Sweden 2 weeks ago, Robert Felt paid tribute to a great scientist and a great friend who had touched the lives of many. All those who worked on the Seabase project with Simon, we heard earlier today, have fond memories of doing so, and many are giving tributes today or are otherwise here. Simon worked hard and had a very fine mind. It's an ideal combination. He served the search-based community well by refereeing tutorials on experimental rigour and chairing the various conferences and workshops. The community had enormous respect for him and for his research work, awarding 5 Best Paper Prizes, and he was runner-up in the British Computer Society Best Dissertation Award for PhD. Simon brought his imagination to bear on problems of interest and called on his analytic mathematics background to ensure the research he produced was of a standard and a rigour he was happy with. Simon was greatly admired by his students too. He was a truly engaging lecturer and presenter. It was apparent to anybody who attended his lectures or was supervised by him that he valued the engagements and that they were important. Put simply, Simon did it well, whatever it was. He engaged with ease, speaking and writing superbly. Calm, kind, playful, convincing, curious, elegant, and deeply thoughtful, both in his work and his interests in the world around him. Simon simply had what I would describe, perhaps in a rather old-fashioned way, as style. His sudden departure is a shock to those who knew him personally, to those who worked with him, and to those who are currently working with him. The qualities he showed, we should all aspire to, all of them, and best of luck when you try to do so, I should point out. Meeting with Simon was never boring. No, 2 meetings were never the same. Nothing, it was just different every time we sort of met. In fact, listening to the parts earlier on about his mercurial career, the only constant I can recall over the past probably 2006, so it's going to be 11 years, was the request for references, which I was very happy to oblige doing that. Simon was a wonderful person, We've heard about his tremendous intellect. He was very kind indeed, and he will be missed, and will ensure the community remembers him.
We're now going to take a few moments of contemplation, and we'll hear some more music from Kate Bush, who Simon deeply loved, and I'm going to attempt to light a candle. I'd like to invite everybody to stand up. And I would like to invite the choir, who can actually sing, like me, to lead us in a rousing version of Dancing Queen. The lyrics are on your and you better sing.
I think he's doing 4 bars.
Okay.
Yeah. We're doing the duo. He's playing, we're doing, and they're singing.
You can dance
Thank you so much. This brings an end to the proceedings today. The stories were fantastic. It was the right event, it had the right feel, and thank you all so much for coming. A couple of reminders. There is a book of remembrance just to the left, if you'd like to sign that. And there will be a buffet just out where you came in, and we'd be delighted to stay and share some hugs. So, thank you all so much.